Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today we are finally doing my reading wrap up for the month of May. I know I spoke about this in my last video, but I will be putting up my men writing women in a semi-decent, very feminist way video that should be going up next. I have a part 1 to that, which is my top recommendations for women writing in horror. That I put up like maybe 2 videos ago, so the follow-up to that will be my next video up. But today we are going to go through my wrap-up. I met my reading goal this month. I did read 6 books. Very, very stoked on that. I have 2 5 stars in here. I have a lot of 3 stars in here. And most of these books do have full-length reviews. 2 of them don't, just because I didn't feel the need to do a review beyond this, but we're going to talk about them and go from there. So let's start with the first book that I read, and that was A Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. Oh my god, I am kicking myself so much for not having read this sooner. I have a full in-depth review on this book, but I loved this book. I absolutely loved it. I'm going to read the inside flap really quickly. So it says, in a cottage overlooking the windswept Maine coast, Wilder Harlow has begun the last book he will ever write. It is the story about the sun-drenched summer days of his youth in Whistler Bay and the blood-stained path of the killer that stalked his small vacation town. About the terrible secret he and his companions, Nat and Harper, discovered entombed in the coves off the bay, and how the pact they swore that day echoed down the decades, forever shaping their lives. But the more Wilder writes, the less he trusts himself in his memory. He starts to see things that can't be real, notes hidden in the cottage from an old friend now dead, a woman with dark hair drowning in the icy waters below, calling for help. Entire chapters he doesn't recall typing, appearing overnight. Who or what is haunting Wilder? No longer able to trust his own eyes, Wilder begins to fear that this will not only be his last book, but the last thing he ever does. Looking Glass Sound is another masterful story from Catriona Ward about friendship and betrayal, dark obsessions, and the impossibility of escaping your own story. This is really interesting. This whole book is built on the concept of frame stories, and it is very much an open letter / critique on who owns a story. Who, like, does an author own a story? Does the person who actually lived out the events but never wrote them down own the story? It's a really, really cool concept. It's part meta fiction meets coming of age story. First 100 or so pages are some of the best coming of age story tales I think I've ever heard. I really, really loved it. It reminded me so much of It, of December Park, of my favorite coming of age horror stories, just done in a really cool and intriguing way. Then paralleled with this kind of crazy meta House of Leaves-y breaking of the fourth wall kind of narrative, hidden within a story, within a story, within a story, and I absolutely loved it. So if you were a fan of The Last House on Needless Street, I really think this is going to give you what you want from Catriona Ward's kind of twisty-turny tales. But if you also are somebody who just loves coming-of-age horror the way that I do, this book is for you as well, especially those first 100. I think it's like 115 pages. The first, 2 full chapters, just like a mini chapter in between. But if you just read that, I feel like that could be a novel all on its own, and it wouldn't need, the next 200 pages that follow. You would still be so satisfied with the story. And I think that's part of the brilliance of this kind of metafiction style that Catriona Ward has. Wilder is just such a compelling and genuine character, and you're going to have your emotions really put to the test when it comes to characters like Nat and Harper and Pearl. And I just absolutely loved this novel. I was blown away. I'm so mad that it took me so long to finally get to this book. I wasn't a fan of Little Eve, which was the last large release that Catriona Ward had, even though it was, I believe, her debut novel just being re-released. So it kind of put me off wanting to read her newer stuff, even though I did really enjoy Sundial and I really did enjoy The Last House on Needless Street. But this is the book that's going to make Catriona Ward an instant buy author for me. I was obsessed with it, and I don't want to say much more beyond that because I want you guys to be immersed in the journey, and the premise on the inside flap of the book really doesn't give anything away about what this novel is actually about, and I do kind of appreciate that. Ooh. Okay, next up we have Day of the Door by Laurel Hightower. I do have a full in-depth review on this as well. I'm going to read the back really, really quickly. Once there were 4 Lasco siblings banded together against a world that failed to protect them. But on a hellish night that marked the end of their childhood, eldest brother Sean died violently after being dragged behind closed doors. Though the official finding was accidental death, Nathan Lasco knows better and has never forgiven their mother Stella. Now, 2 decades later, Stella promises to finally reveal the truth of what happened on the day of the door. Accompanied by a paranormal investigative team, the Lasco family comes together one final time, but no one is prepared for the revelations waiting for them on the 3rd floor. Laurel Hightower is becoming one of those authors that I'm going to buy everything that she releases, and I'm always going to be left wanting more from her. I feel like she has amazing, amazing concepts and really unique takes on like classic horror tropes, but then fails to fully execute them to a satisfying way. I'm never unsatisfied with her writing. I just want her to expand upon it. I every time I read something from Laurel Hightower, I'm like, oh, this needs 50 more pages. It needs 100 more pages. Why was it in a novella? It should have been a full-length novel. And that is how I felt about The Day of the Door. Somebody commented on my full-length review of this and was like, this felt like the trailer, or like the pilot episode. I forget exactly what it was. Basically, it was like, this felt like the pilot episode setting up for an amazing series, but then we just never got anything beyond that. And I completely agree with this. I wanted so much more. I felt like the only character who was really fleshed out was Stella, who was kind of our main antagonist. And everybody else was kind of a static character who was there to push the narrative forward to get to the conclusion that Laurel Hightower had created without any of the, explanation as to why we were getting to that conclusion. I just wanted so much more. I was left with way more questions than answers, and I just felt like I couldn't connect to any of the characters because she was just trying so hard to get the story told without taking her time to really get us into the mind of our protagonists. And they, to me, were supposed to be the most interesting characters because they end up being the ones that we actually find out the least about, and their motivations are so minimal and so basic that it begs the question, why are they acting in these extreme ways? And I felt like their characters really kind of flipped and did things that they weren't set up to do because they didn't have enough background for the reader to understand why they were doing certain things. I also felt that the concept of bringing in like a paranormal investigative TV show was really, really lost in this book. Like, it wasn't necessarily needed. It felt very underplayed, and I wish it could have been elevated far, far more because it is a very unique, fun, and interesting concept. And I say unique, and I'm about to talk about another book that does the exact same thing in a completely different way, but it's something that I really, really like as somebody who likes to consume horror media. These paranormal investigation shows, I don't really watch them, but when I do, I think they're funny, I think they're interesting, I kind of like the absurdity of it all, and I think it works really well with the concept of a horror novel. When you look at something like Paul Tremblay's A Head Full of Ghosts, like that I think is the perfect execution of combining our obsession with reality TV with horror media today, and it's just done so tactfully. In this book, I wanted that to have that moment, and it just didn't. So this fell flat to me. And it wasn't 4 stars. I did enjoy reading it. I do like Laurel Hightower's writing, but I just wanted more from everything overall. And that's just a constant thing that I see with Laurel Hightower, is I do enjoy her writing style, but I just always feel like there needs to be more, and then there just isn't. Okay. Next up, just to follow in the trend of reality TV, I finally picked up episode 13 by Craig DeLuey. Do also have a full video review on this. I got this at Little Ghost Bookshop in Toronto, Canada. I love that bookstore. Every time I'm in Toronto, I have to go there. It's just awesome. It's just a full horror bookstore. It's literally just horror books. It's great. And they always have like awesome indie authors and like small release like indie press books, and they're great. So I picked this up last time I was there. Heard many good things. Again, we are doing reality television in a horror story. This one's told through like found footage style, like it's like almost like an epistolary, whatever you call it. I'm gonna read the back of the book real quick. Fade to Black is the newest hit ghost hunting reality TV show, led by husband and wife team Matt and Claire Kirkland. It features a dedicated crew of ghost hunting experts. Episode 13 takes them to every ghost hunter's holy grail, the Paranormal Research Foundation. This crumbling, derelict mansion holds secrets and clues about bizarre experiments that took place there in the 1970s. It's also undoubtedly haunted, and Matt hopes to use scientific techniques and high-tech gear to prove it. But as the house begins to slowly reveal itself to the crew, proof of an afterlife might not be everything Matt dreamed of. I loved the style of this novel. I thought the found footage and diary entries worked really, really well to not only give us a glimpse into who these characters are, but to kind of create like a fast-paced drama that almost felt like a TV show or a documentary. So I really loved Craig DeLuise' writing in this, and I was so on board for the first half of this novel, where it was exactly what I was hoping for Day of the Door, where we're getting that parallel of, like, reality television drama surrounded by an actual haunting caught on tape. And I was so excited for that. I really, really, like, loved how Craig DeLuise was building up the characters and building up the haunting and building up the history and building up the lore. And then halfway through, this book just took a complete turn and became like a lesser version of House of Leaves, where like the house doesn't fit the space it's supposed to, and there's these like crazy interdimensional tunnels and people are going through them and trying to discover things and blah 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 blah. I've seen it done before in a much better way. And Craig DeLuise started to highlight my least favorite character. Claire, I thought, was a really interesting kind of foil to Matt as this, like, typical main character, lead of a TV show, kind of pretty boy, super passionate about what he does. He's kind of this, like, golden retriever husband. And then you have Claire, who's, like, really doubtful about her place there because she is the skeptic and she's the scientist and her job is to disprove it. And it's a really cool discourse that they have. But then she just kind of becomes this egomaniac, and I just hated her, and I hated how selfish she was, and I hated how much she endangered people for her own scientific journeys and just didn't care about anybody else when everybody else really did care about her. And she was just so unlikable and just took over as this, like, unlikely lead in a way that made the book really just unenjoyable for me. I just did not like being in her head. I didn't like following her. I didn't like understanding what her revelations were. It just didn't mean anything to me. And by taking the story out of its kind of central haunted house reality television found footage gone wrong sort of scenario and putting it into this like very like interdimensional, beyond human comprehension kind of setting, the way that House of Leaves does, without kind of having the underlying attention to detail and hidden messaging that House of Leaves does, it just became this kind of overly ambitious story for me that then created more questions than answers. And I felt like had it just been contained to the way that the first half of this narrative was, I would have connected with it so much more and been like, that's a great way to do a found footage paranormal investigation reality TV show story. Because again, it's kind of becoming this trend, and I feel like only Paul Tremblay has done it correctly. But this just, I thought, bit off more than it could chew and really couldn't hold up to like the premise it had set up for the first half. And I also felt like the characters really started to deteriorate, and similar to to Day of the Door, they started to lose who they were set up to be at the beginning to fit the narrative. I felt like a lot of our main characters started to kind of act in ways they normally wouldn't have for the first half of the book, just so the narrative would be pushed forward, and it just didn't work for me. That being said, I really, really loved Craig DeLuise' writing style. We'll definitely be reading more from him, but the first half of this book was basically a 5-star read, and then the second half just dropped it down to a 3-star, so total 3-star overall, because I just wanted it to keep the momentum it had at the beginning and not get as like crazy and convoluted as it did, and then the payoff just wasn't worth it in the end for me. And the ending was so confusing. Like, I think I understand what happened, but like I shouldn't be sitting here scratching my head like what happened when it's not that when it's really not that serious of a novel. This isn't House of Leaves, and it's really trying to be at the end, and it felt very displaced. Okay, next up, so I read Our Own Unique Affliction by Scott J. Moses. I read this really, really quickly. I'm going to read the back of the book for you. It says, Our Own Unique Affliction is the story of Alice Ann, a dejected immortal who longs for her life in the sun, navigating guilt, loss, family, meaning, murder, and all of that comes with the curse of living forever. An existential bleak quiet until it's not. Hallucination on duality, rife with fangs, empathy, blood, and grief. Okay, two things. So the back of that book kind of sounded a little confusing, and that's kind of how the narrative in the story is. I was a little bit lost reading it. Granted, I was also very sick when I was reading it, so it could have just been a lot of brain fog, but I was really lost about how every single chapter kind of connected to the overall story. Every chapter, there's only like 5 like kind of long, lengthy chapters, really kind of felt like these like almost like slice of life essays about what it's like to be a vampire who was turned into a vampire in like the late 1800s, but like living in modern day. And as like slice of life essays, I thought they were really cool and really interesting, but as an overall narrative, it became really, really confusing because Scott J. Moses, who I've never read or heard of before, was really, really vague and was really heavily relying on this kind of show don't tell and like allow the reader to take implications to form conclusions about his narrative. However, he didn't lay enough groundwork for me to feel like I made the proper conclusions on what he was talking about. I do like Alice Ann. I thought she was a really, really unique character. You can tell she has a lot of demons, and you can see, too, reading the story, how this is definitely a very personal story to Scott J. Moses. He talks about that a lot in his afterword as well, but you can really feel how this is about loss and grief and human emotion and figuring out your, like, place in life, obviously told through the eyes of a vampire, and there's these moments of betrayal, and there are these moments of, like, random acts of kindness that seem very foreign to somebody who is this, like, bloodthirsty, eternal being, and I really liked the overall tone of this story. I just felt that the narrative was really lost for me, and it would have worked better as like a series of vampiric essays than trying to be one coherent story, because the I think it was like chapter 4 got really confusing, and there was a lot of characters kind of just dumped on us, and a lot of like characters that were just kind of added within like chapters 3 and 4, and I didn't really understand why they were there, what purpose they served, because they were kind of like characters in like later Sopranos seasons where they're like introduced in an episode and 2 episodes later they're gone, and you're just like, why did that happen? So I don't know. I another thing that bothered me is the title of the book is Our Own Unique Affliction. It's also the name of a chapter in the book, and then it's also literally a line in the book. So it was like really like, this is what this is about kind of moment. But it did kind of remind me too of like David Foster Wallace, where like you get those kind of essays, and like the main essay becomes also the title of the book. Like, I wish this wasn't a collection of essays based on what it's like to be a vampire, just not a narrative. And I think it would have worked so much better and so much more smoothly to have these like slice of life moments with Alice Ann, and it just didn't quite work that way. Chapters 3 and 4 really threw things off for me because I didn't quite understand the ramifications and the severity of some of the plot points that were happening to the degree that I think Scott J. Moses wanted us to, because it really became kind of muddied and unclear, especially when Alice Ann starts to realize like what her sister's actually doing and who her sister's working with, and I just didn't understand why, and the heaviness and the weight that falls on Alice Ann I don't think was conveyed clearly enough for me. And again, it could have just been my brain fog, but very, very interesting. Definitely didn't hate it. 3-star read overall, but just because I found the concept really unique and really compelling, but I just think the actual storytelling got really, really muddy throughout it. Okay, next up, I read Ling by Ai Zhang. I think that's how you say it. This is a limited edition Twisted Retreat book. It is so beautiful, and it's really, really short. And I was very excited to read this because I had seen that this had like really, really high reviews. This edition is beautiful, and it's kind of a like really crazy concept. I'm going to read the Goodreads synopsis because it's not on the book. Welcome home. Follow Wen Kui, Liam, and Mrs. in this modern gothic ghost story by Chinese-Canadian writer and immigrant Ai Zhang. I'm so sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Ling Han is set in the mysterious town of Home, a place where the dead live again as spirits, conjured by the grief-sick population that refuses to let go. Okay, so first, Ling Han, I believe, is, it translates to either spirit or ghost, and this concept of home I thought was really interesting. It seems to be this, like, neighborhood right outside of Toronto for some reason, where you can buy a haunted house and summon the ghost of a recently lost loved one, which is a really cool kind of dystopian concept. And you have the rich are able to inhabit the homes, and the kind of poorer people who can't afford homes basically become homeless, vying for a like Hunger Games style auction to then inhabit a home. Very interesting, very weird concept. Not gothic. This was marketed to me as like Chinese gothic tale, and I read from some reviews that like this is very much in line with kind of like modern day Chinese like storytelling, like the kind of way that you would modernize folklore in like traditional like Chinese literature of today. reads a lot like this story did, but to me it just felt really, really jumbled. It was like the pacing was weird, the character development was weird, the kind of time jumps were weird, and I just didn't feel like I needed anything beyond just trying to understand the town. We get really in depth into Wenqui and Liam, and a little bit of Mrs., but their characters never feel fully fleshed out, and that therefore when like the last third of the book happens and it's really character driven instead of setting driven, it was really hard for me to connect with the characters because I didn't understand why I was supposed to care about them yet. I was still interested in trying to understand the message of like what home is, and this concept of like grief destroying you and grief destroying families and grief recreating who your characters are. And I loved that messaging of this story, but again, it didn't have the kind of gothic tone I am used to. It was very, very dystopian. It was very, very metaphorical in a really truly bleak and well done way, but the characters inhabiting this metaphor didn't help push that metaphor forward, and then it kind of became this weird love story out of nowhere that didn't quite make sense to me, and some of the rules of the neighborhood kind of started to fade away. Like the beginning, we're told that those who don't live in homes can't really interact with those who do, and then it's like that for like a chapter or two, and then all of a sudden it's like, but never mind, like kind of everybody talks to everybody, and it just was setting up all these weird things that I didn't quite understand. And I really wanted more from the character of Mrs., because I feel like at the end we are supposed to have this big revelation about who she is and like why she is the way she is, but I just felt like there was some kind of disconnect, and I never understood who she was or what she was doing or why she felt tied to home and her husband and the origins of how she got to home and whether she was the start of home or not. And there was just so many unanswered questions, and I just felt such a disconnect from the characters. So while I really loved the concept, and I found the concept really beautiful and haunting, the execution and the characters who inhabited this really cool setting just didn't quite work for me. And I feel like it could have been kind of like a cultural barrier of I'm just not used to reading a style of writing like this. But I also felt like I just didn't have the ability to really understand why I was supposed to care about certain characters. I just didn't feel connected to them at all. And they were our three main characters for the most part. So this was a 3-star read. Really, again, really interesting and cool, very unique concept, but it just didn't click with me. Okay, and last but not least, I'm going to keep this really, really short because this is a sequel and I do have a full-length video on this, but this is Becoming the Boogeyman by Richard Shizmar. This is the sequel to Chasing the Boogeyman, which was one of my favorite reads of 2021. I'm not going to read the back of this book because it will contain spoilers to Chasing the Boogeyman, and if you haven't read that novel, I really, 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 really recommend it, especially if you're into true crime. This was a 5-star read for me. I really, really loved it. I thought it was an extremely well done sequel to Chasing the Boogeyman. I don't think it was as good as Chasing the Boogeyman because I think the charm and mystique of writing a novel like it's real true crime, like a real nonfiction true crime documentary style book, is really unique. I think pushing it to be a sequel is definitely a little bit of a stretch of the imagination, which is where it kind of falls short to me, is the illusion that this is real is broken in this book, because the chances of our main character having all of these different interactions with these true crime events, the actual statistics and chances of that happening in real life are pretty much zero. So you do have to go into this just kind of being like, okay, this is going to be written like a true crime documentary, but now it's on the level of absurdist because I no longer believe that this could actually happen. However, Shizmar does a really, 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 really good job of trying to convince you that it is real. Not as compelling as Chasing the Boogeyman, not as believable as Chasing the Boogeyman, but pretty darn close for what he's working with. And he does a really, really, really good job, I would say, of humanizing his, like, fake victims, because obviously they're made up, they're not real. Even more so, I think, in this novel than he did in the first one. We got really, really good glimpses into who these victims were, and the whole time, like, you know bad things are about to happen to them, and you're reading it and you're like, no, 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 like, absolutely, you can't let that happen, like, please don't let it happen. The fact that I was on the edge of my seat caring about these characters who I felt like were real people when they were just figments of Richard Shizmar's imagination really did remind me a lot of like the joy that I had of reading the original Chasing the Boogeyman. I do like that it's being set up to be like a series now because I really enjoy this style of writing. But as I said pretty thoroughly in my in-depth review, like, you do lose that charm of being convinced that it's a real story with the first one as this kind of continues onwards. And I do love how Richard Chizmar does kind of put himself in the book, where the lines between fiction and autobiography are really, really blurred. So it's really fun to be able to see who this person is, who this author is, even though they are the main character in a completely fictionalized story. The setting is also great. It's set in rural Maryland. I am from Maryland, so I love reading about these little small towns because I can really see it because I've been there before. So it's definitely one of those stories that I was just really, really pleased with. So this was a 5-star follow-up. Definitely not as good as the first one, but if you want a more in-depth review on this, go check out my full video because it will have spoilers about the first novel, but it won't spoil anything about this. I just don't want to talk about this too in-depth because I will actually ruin the first book for you guys if you have not read that yet. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. As always, I try to post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays. And if you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and I will catch you in the next one. Mwah.